My name is Christopher Dawes, and today I wanted to share with you about tables and using those within Domino Vault. Quick look at our agenda. This is where we're going to go today. There's lots of bouncing back and forth. I've got some demos and different things that I'm going to show, and hopefully we can keep that as fluid as possible. The first question that we felt was important to share was, why do we use a table? When do we use a table? And so I put together a list of kind of the most common uses that I have encountered in my experience. And so the first and most obvious one is just that we're providing a control that allows users to provide a list of data. So you have a form, they need to list out their children and birth dates and other information. Maybe it's a listing of accounts. There's lots of reasons, lots of different kinds of data that you can collect from a user. It allows them to dynamically add the rows as they need to. Tables can have any number of columns themselves. So really good for collecting a list of data. They can also be used as a view only for rendering a list of information that might be for reference. So we're pulling information from some external source and we're rendering it as reference. It can also be used as a list of data records that need to be updated, and that data can come from several different places. It could be from a service, it could be populated by JavaScript. We can use tables as a selection vehicle. So we have a listing of places that we need to go. I can click on one of those and there can be code that directs me to some other place in my form, or possibly to another form altogether. It can be used as a hidden control that might take the output of a service. Maybe we have a service that returns me a list of data. We can use that table as a container for that. And then we might have code that does something with that output. We can also use it as an input to a service where we might be sending data to some third-party service. In these last two, they can be visible or they could be hidden. I've certainly encountered situations where I don't want to render the information, but I want to still be able to send it to a service. And in some cases, I might be dynamically building the table and the content that I'm then going to send to the service. And so that's why I made a point of saying that they are potentially hidden. There may be other uses. I didn't come up with any at the time, so kind of my high level categorizations of where I might use a table. Some high level information about tables. You may have seen this before. Certainly if you've gone through any of our other slide decks, this might be stuff you've seen before. So a table has two components to it. When you add a table to a form, there is automatically going to be a summary view and then a data entry view. And so as I add data, when I click on the add button, I'm going to see this data entry view that's going to render the fields that have been defined. And as I add rows, they're going to then show up as the summary. In this release of Vault, we don't have a lot of built-in ways to customize the view of the summary. Some things can be done with CSS, and there are a couple of things that you can change, like I have in my third bullet here, where you can change the number of rows that are visible. You can change whether or not the buttons are visible and like where the location of those buttons are. You can change the labels, but the style editor doesn't currently have any like table options. You can't change the color of the table or anything like that. So for that, you'd have to use CSS, and I'll show a little bit that later. And then as far as the using JavaScript with the table, if you saw my JavaScript session, I talked about there's a UI component and a data component. Well, table is the same thing. There's that UI and data. Something that people always kind of find confusing as well is that when you click on the properties for the table object that's on the canvas, that's different than clicking on the properties of the table object that's in the outline view. So the properties for the object that's on the canvas is really pertaining to the summary and how we manipulate that, right? The number of rows that we display is pertaining to the summary view and really doesn't have any bearing on the actual edit view, like when we're adding a row. And the IDs of those objects can be different. Now, generally, I try to keep them the same because I find it less confusing if they are. But just know that they are different. And if you wanted to edit the properties of this dialog for your edit entry, that's going to be done through the properties in the outline view, and that's the only way to access that. I know I have received a lot of questions around that, so just be aware of that. Some other things you might not know about tables is that if you click on a table header, that will automatically sort that column. And that is from a user perspective. So there's nothing at a design time that you can do to change that, with the exception of adding a CSS class to disable the header sort. If you click it once, it sorts it by ascending. If you click it again, it sorts it by descending. And you can see which column is sorted by the arrow that gets added to that column. And the arrow indicates the direction of the sort. And so any of those columns can be clicked to sort that content. Tables can be nested. So you can have a table inside of a table inside of a table. I think our general rule of thumb was don't nest more than 7 times. I haven't actually tested that recently. But I know that was something that we had documented. Mostly it's around real estate and being buried inside of dialogues. A table is also a form. So when you add a table widget to your form, that's also creating a table in the back end where that data is going to be stored separately from the host, the main page data. And also something that's important to note, which you can't really find anywhere, but is important for JavaScript uses later on, is that when you create a form, that form gets an automatic page, and that page is the thing when you're adding a row, that's what you see. And this is the ID of that page. It's not really anywhere else. So if you're going to be doing any manipulation of the page within the table, that's something that you're going to want to take note of. I guess the key thing is that it is just the default naming of the page, and so that should make it easier to remember, or you can look at what the default is for the main form. They're generally the same. So rules can also be used inside of tables. They work just fine. The reason that is mentioned there is that services, the second point down is that table fields can't be used as inputs to services. So that's something that's a limitation in Volt today. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that later and how we can kind of work around some of that as well, which can be very important and is something that I've done in pretty much every implementation that I've done for a customer. So it's very common to work around that at this point. Something else that people don't necessarily know is that the columns in the summary view can be either removed or added. So every time you add a field to a table, Volt will automatically add it to the summary view. But there may be situations where you don't want a particular field to appear in the summary. So if you click on the properties for the table UI, you can actually delete a column that you don't want there, and you can reorder them, and you can also adjust the width, right? So that comes in handy when you're trying to create a really nice summary view. And one of the things, I think I talk about it later, but real estate is a significant issue. And so generally when you're working with tables, you don't want every column, especially if you have a table that has 20 fields in it. And you might be using that table for data entry, but the real data entry part and what the user needs to know about what they need to enter is when they actually click add row. So really the best practice is that we only render the most critical information for someone to identify the row that they're going to edit. And one other thing that I'm mentioning here is that a table doesn't have a valid event. And you know, I'm kind of on the fence as to what I think this is and how we classify it. There are some other objects in Volt right now where you'll see a lot of JavaScript events. Not all of them apply. And in general, they do, but there's a few where, like in my opinion, I think we probably need to remove those or we need to make them work. That's something that we're looking at. But I wanted to mention that here specifically because there have been times where I've wanted to make a table or kind of notify the user that they haven't entered things into the table the way they're supposed to. And so I would want to programmatically make it valid or invalid. I can't do that. The good news is that required works for the table, so you can make it required. And the other good news is that if you have fields that are in a rule or that fields are required themselves and those are invalid, then the table itself will indicate that something is wrong with the table. It's just that you can't programmatically make the table valid or invalid. But the validation around the rows and the fields in the table, that all works as expected. All right, so we're going to start getting into talking about some of the different cases for tables. And these are probably moving more on the advanced side of using tables. So a table can list any set of data. It's really a list control. And so you can use it as just a single column. And in that way, it's kind of like, you know, it's really no different than a drop-down or a multi-select list or a select one in that case, right? I'm displaying a list of data that users can select, but but the selection isn't something that's remembered, right? So it's really not that kind of control. But I've used tables kind of like a list box where you might select something from one table and it pushes over into another table. I don't have an example of that today, but even this screenshot here kind of shows you that concept of where you'd have a list on one side and a list on another side, and you can kind of push things back and forth. So lots of creative ways you can use tables. So when we're going to use a table for being the recipient of data from a service, we need to create fields in that table that represent all of the output items or input items, depending on whether you're going, which direction you're going with the service. And then you're going to create a service, select your service, and then you're going to link your inputs and your outputs. And in this case, I'm showing my outputs, where the outputs from the service I'm linking to my table fields, and then I need to determine when that service is going to get executed. Depending on if it's a view only, you might execute that service in the onload or in the on-show of the table. If the table needs to be populated as the result of somebody entering data into some other field, you might do it in the on-item change of that field, or you might provide them a button to say, hey, enter the data into this field and click this button, and then we're going to bring you back a bunch of results. Something that is important to note, but can be confusing, is that if you are setting up a table to be the recipient of data from a service, it's not automatically going to know that if you modify rows in that table, that it's going to update the source data. Doesn't work that way. Really, you're just using the table as the rendering vehicle. And if you actually want the data to go back to the source data, then you're going to have to use services to do that. That's going to have to be a pushback service that updates, and likely you'd have to decide, but given on the source data, whether you're doing that as a row is updated, are you pushing back to the service, or are you going to push back to the parent service once all the data has been updated? And that totally depends on what that source data is. All right, so the first demonstration is actually not my form, it's Marty's form. But here is a table, and he's actually demonstrating a couple of the use cases where if I make a selection, it's going to change what is being rendered inside of this table. And so there's a service that's being used, and one of the inputs is my product line, and then it's going to change the outputs that get returned to me, and it renders inside of this table. And then the other thing that I think is really cool that's done here is that when you click on a row, it takes me to a page that shows me more detail about that particular record. So, you know, I think the way we've seen tables is they might double click on this row and it opens up the dialog to see the table, but this is actually removing that and using the table as the render, and then the selection vehicle, and then the actual editing the information is done over on a different page, where kind of you have more control of what goes in there. This mechanism also gets around the fact that services can't be used within a table. So because we've got the fields on a natural page, you can have them populated by a service, and then you can be using JavaScript to push the content back into the table. So that's one way of getting around the limitation of services not being able to use inside of a table. The other form that I wanted to show is not as pretty, but it is is this one that I actually have posted in the wiki, and I'll make all of these available for download, but they're also in the wiki that you can download. And the reason, yeah, so this one just kind of shows you things that are supposed to be hidden, but it kind of shows you how everything works. And so this data is coming from this form. There's multiple forms of this application, and so when I click on a row, I'm calling a service to pull out the data, and then I can add additional information, which is storing it in another form, and I can add new customers and whatnot. So again, just a demonstration of using a table to render some information, but also make it as a selection vehicle. When I click on a row, I then now am reacting to that user action and taking some other action. So both of those demonstrations talk about or sort of demonstrate this next talk, which is tables are a really easy way for us to render a bunch of information, but we can also use it as navigation control. And so user clicks on that row, and then we do something, we react in some way. Again, how you implement it is going to be based on your use case, and the table can contain basically anything you want, but it's important to understand that the summary view doesn't render all controls. So if you created a table with just a text item, that text item doesn't show up in the summary. Some other controls don't actually show up in the summary, but something like a web link does show up in the summary, and it actually is a clickable link, and that is clickable from the summary view. Attachments, I'm trying to remember now. I don't actually have a demonstration of it here today, but I think right now attachments don't show up in the summary view, and I think that's something that we're changing for the next version, where you'll actually see the file name and you can click on it from the summary view and download it. So when you're building your table for your summary view, it's just you may need to play with it to make sure that it's showing what you want it to show, that it's then useful for your selection, for your users to know what they're selecting and where they're going to go. Again, like I said before, real estate is an issue. So generally you don't want to render all the table fields in your summary view. I think before I missed one of my demonstrations from before. I just kind of got mixed up here. So I think that's okay. I'll keep going. All right. Sometimes when you're dealing with lots of data in your tables, you want to paginate them. This is not currently a built-in feature for Volt today, something we're looking at, but right now, if you want to provide any kind of pagination, it's going to be a bit of a custom effort. Now, if you're using the Volt apps as a service, all of those have input parameters that enable you to do pagination control. Now, so if you call a Volt app as a service, I believe by default, it's like 50 or 100, but you can specify a page size and then a page number, and you can then control how many of those things come back. And as you can see here, I've built a little form where I have next buttons. If you want to get them in the right place, you might have to use some JavaScript. If you want to use custom images, you can, which is what I'm showing here in this next screenshot here. This actually isn't the table, and I'll talk a little bit about that in one of my next slides, but I'm using the next and previous buttons here as images. This does exactly the same thing as what I'm going to show you here. And so I've got that form. So in here, I've actually preloaded this with a bunch of information. And again, I can add information here. This isn't as important, but it just demonstrates that I have a form that's using a service to push content into my backend data, and then this table automatically refreshes. You didn't see it because I've actually got 59 items in here, but I can change the number of items per page, and it automatically changes the height of the table. I can jump to another page if I want to say jump to the 5th page. So you can experiment with the type of controls you want to present to the user, and then I can navigate this way. So there's a bunch of code that interacts with all these controls that then every time I'm pressing one of these or changing one of these controls, it's manipulating and calling the service. So the key items here are the number of items per page and the current page. And you'll notice that as I click to the next, it's actually changing what that current is. And so we're jumping through, jumping windows of the data set. And there's the HCL one that you saw me add. So it's dynamically doing that. All of these are available in the wiki, and so I'm not actually going to go deep into the code today, but really it's a demonstration of how we can use tables, how we can do pagination. The code really here isn't complicated either, right? All I'm tracking is the page and the current, and when I call the service, I'm just sending the new inputs and I'm getting back my result. And so it's just knowing when I need to call that service. So anything that modifies those two variables needs to call the service. So manipulating a table with JavaScript, this overlaps a little bit with the JavaScript session that you may have seen. But I wanted to call it out specifically here so that, yeah, we're talking about tables, and so this is relevant to a table. The controls in a table, on my previous slide, you saw that we can have buttons, and those buttons can be either at the bottom of the table or they can be in each row. You can hide those programmatically, and these are the functions to do so. These functions are also listed. All the functions that I've shown here are listed in the Volt JavaScript documentation. And so we can hide or show them. And so there might be situations where, for example, one place where I've used it is you might want a user to only enter, say they can enter up to 5 items in their table. So when they get to that 5th item, you might want to hide the add button because you say, no, you can't add any more than 5. We still let them edit or remove, but we're going to hide that add button. And then if they remove an item from the table, we're going to show the add button again. And that code would be done in the on add or on remove events of the table. And then that way you can dynamically control those buttons, which then controls how the form behaves for those users. Really cool functionality, something I've used lots, and it takes that form to the next level, right? Because instead of just allowing, putting text in there that says, oh, don't add more than 5, but somebody could, this makes it so they can't. Getting a selected row, you've seen that in a couple of the demonstrations already. It's just a simple function, and it's a UI function, right? So you'll notice the syntax here. It's item.getSelection if I'm in an event of the table, or it's page.table.getSelection if I'm referencing it from somewhere else. Now, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to try to get the selection from some other. It's usually done in the on-click event of the table because at that point we know that it has been selected. If you are going to be asking for a selection from a table, make sure you do a null check, or that you check that the selection is not equal to -1. And then generally, when you're done with a selection, the recommendation is to set the selection to -1. And that will clear the selection off of the screen, and it will clear the selection out of memory.